our resident expert, Michelle Coleman. Well, so this for a round of applause.
Yay!
Alright, Michelle, you've been working in EFL for some time now, is that right?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here in Bolton.
In Bolton, that's right, in
yes.
Bolton, there you are. Right, so you've been in EFL for a while, and you heard earlier on the debate that was going on live in this studio.
I did. It was extremely interesting to hear such discourse on a level of informed debate. So I was very, very happy to have been privy to that discussion.
Absolutely. So we picked up on a couple of points that we thought you, as an EFL expert, might have something to say about. First one, are you ready?
I'm ready. A little nervous, but ready, yes.
Right, well, we were talking about reading aloud, and someone said, if you don't get them to read aloud, the students will just go to sleep. Reading aloud means everyone's paying attention. What do you think of that comment?
The idea of reading aloud has been something that I've been thinking about for 20 years in the EFL classroom and in real classrooms, because when I started working in EFL, it was absolutely forbidden to ever read anything aloud, ever, because the idea was that students couldn't possibly remember what they were reading and they couldn't really retain it or really understand it. My opinion's a little different now. Mm-hmm. Can I share that with you?
Absolutely. We just want to hear your opinion and in what teaching context and experiences you made this successful.
Okay. I work in a school, and I train teachers who work in schools. And the reason that my opinion has shifted a little bit is because I've seen children reading aloud in ways that they've enjoyed, in ways that have helped them to develop their literacy skills, and in ways that have been relevant to them, which was very different to what I'd learned on my CELTA 20 years ago. And however, there's a big caveat connected to that, which is that a lot of teachers think that reading aloud is inside a comprehension skill. And for me, I think they're two very separate things. Reading aloud teaches you to read aloud, and there's some value to that, but it's not part of understanding, in my humble opinion. So when I've seen students reading aloud successfully, there have been some conditions which have been helpful to them. For example, the text has been slightly below the level of language. So in order to read aloud successfully and to feel that they're reading correctly and to feel that they're producing, or not even producing, but they're saying things in the right way, the texts have been below the level of language competence. When the texts have been above the level of language competence, it's been a disaster. Another condition where I've seen it working really well has been when it hasn't been in an open class environment. And very often the traditional approach is you read one sentence, you read one sentence, you read one sentence, and it's quite humiliating. And the reason that I don't think it works very well is because the teacher doesn't know whether they should correct their pronunciation or their, the way that they're saying the words in front of the entire class, which is humiliating and mortifying at the best of times. And number two, it's really, really boring for the 19 other students that aren't reading at their moment. And what they do is they find the sentence that they're going to read, practice it in their heads, and then just say it when it's their turn. So the other condition that's been in place has been often connected to the fact that they've been reading in pairs or reading in small groups or guided reading. And so controlling the level of text and ensuring that it's done as a kind of peer activity as opposed to an open class activity have been the conditions that have made it a little bit more successful. And another reason that I've seen that people like to do it is because we as EFL teachers don't work in a vacuum. We work often with students that are working with maybe 6 or 7 other teachers, and they're doing these things in their classrooms, and so students have this kind of that they have expectations of how we're going to do the text, and so sometimes it can be quite nice to meet them in the middle, as long as it's not really doing it for comprehension. Because I mean, I know as a student myself, I don't understand or retain anything that I read out loud, especially not in a second language. But if it's done as a reading aloud to learn how to read aloud and to focus on word recognition, sight words, and kind of those literacy things, as opposed to real comprehension, then I think it can be done quite well, which is totally different to what I thought at the beginning.
All right.
That's a long answer to a very short question.
A very long answer.
Sorry.
A lovely answer. Wasn't it a lovely answer? Lovely. Thank you, Michelle. So, like, you know, let me just say it back to you in other words. Depends what you're focusing on.
Yeah.
But reading aloud doesn't focus on reading skills
No.
in terms of comprehension.
No, not at all.
Not at all. Not at all, folks. Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it can help children with literacy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even adults with literacy, presumably.
With conditions in place.
Right, exactly. Okay, let's move on to the next item, which is rather interesting. Somebody said, but they just get stuck on vocabulary and won't understand the gist of the text.
Right.
Now, this is an interesting issue, and I myself have had the privilege to go into some of these lovely schools in Manchester.
Yeah.
And see teachers say to students, are there any words in the text you don't understand? You're laughing, Michelle. She's laughing, people. Shall we find out why?
Yes, Michelle.
Yes. Why is that, Michelle? What's happening?
Because it's the classic example of the most painful way to approach vocabulary and the most painful way to approach reading skill, and combining them both to win the lottery. It's a painful and for me, counterproductive way to deal with both areas, and to demotivate students in terms of their vocabulary and in terms of their reading. So it's like, yeah, you win.
What's the actual issue?
The actual issue is that I think there's two issues. One of which is learner training. I don't think sometimes teachers are helping learners to understand their meta learning, their metacognitive strategies when they're doing reading, and so they're not teaching them the discourse of, right now you're going to read for gist, and until students actually become aware of how they're reading and the reasons why they're reading, they're not going to apply or transfer the skills that they're using. And so reading for gist in itself implies being comfortable with a certain level of ambiguity, being comfortable with not understanding everything, and understanding what the purpose of your reading is. And if you don't understand why you're reading, and you don't understand even the mechanics of how your eyes are supposed to move when you're reading for gist, then you are going to panic and be uncomfortable with the idea. But that's a question of learner training, which involves talking about strategies and purposes for reading. And that takes quite a long time to build in. It's not something that you can do overnight. And so I think it's also because a lot of the teachers are dealing with texts in the same way that they themselves would taught how to deal with text. And we're taught this, it's kind of the classic answer when somebody says, how can I improve my language? Read. You'll learn lots of vocabulary if you read. And text can be a really good way of working with vocabulary, but unfortunately that has kind of moved into vocabulary as the focus of the text, as opposed to the skill being the focus of the text. And so it's a classic sort of, I don't really know how to deal with vocabulary as a teacher. My students don't really know how to deal with it because they're not comfortable with the ambiguity of not understanding every word. So therefore, we're going to focus on every word. And so in that way, you're not dealing with vocabulary effectively, you're just highlighting it. And what the student ends up with is a long list of words that are basically random and disconnected. There's been no kind of cognitive process involved in acquiring the vocabulary either. It's just a case of you don't know it, circle it. And so you're left with this long list of words that goes nowhere, because nobody really goes back to that list, ever. And then the student ends up feeling stupid because the whole focus has been on the words that they don't know as opposed to the words that they do know. And it's just horribly time consuming. And so you haven't really done any reading skills and you haven't really done any vocabulary. So I don't really understand why this is still happening. But I think it's also a lack of planning. I mean, I think a lot of teachers go in with a text and kind of go, there you go, read this. And they don't actually do any scaffolding. Because they're not going through the process of top down or bottom up. They're not going from the general idea into the specific language focus. Sometimes because they just don't know how, and they don't see why it's necessary. So it's a lack of planning and preparation and training sometimes, and sometimes the students don't know how to advocate for themselves either. So it's a bit of a mess, really. But long lists of words are flying around.
It does sound like it, doesn't it? It does sound like a little bit of a mess, actually.
It is a bit of a mess.
You wouldn't do that, would you?
I wouldn't do it, but I've had it done to me many times.
Right.
As a student, as a language learner.
Okay.
And I'm sure you have as well.
So I certainly have, I can tell you that. But that's for another day, audience. Well, let's go back to this thing then. So, like, you know, when you look at a text, let's say it's an authentic text, you're going to take it into your classroom because you think your students are going to love it. Hashtag assignment 1.
Yes,
when you're looking at it and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to take this in. Do you ever think, oh, there's some vocabulary there that they might need a bit of clarification before they read, or do you generally think, no, we'll wait and see what happens?
No, I don't. I generally think wait and see what happens. What I tend to do is like I read the text and try and put myself in the position of the students, not just in terms of their interests, but also in terms of their language level. And think about words that they are likely to know really well. Think about words that they're likely to recognise, but they're not gonna need them. Then there's words that they just genuinely don't know. And from those words, I think about the words and also structures, chunks of language, not just individual words, but chunks of language. And I think about what they really need to be able to access in order to be able to do the task that I want them to do. And so if it's words that they don't know or phrases that they don't know, but they don't need to know them to be able to do the task I want, then I just kind of let it go. And that's when they're going to need to be comfortable with just letting it go. But if it's something that they really need to be able to, if they need to know it before they do the task that I'm asking them to do, then I have to figure out a way of getting that in there before they actually read it, if it's essential to be able to do the task. So I might pre-teach a couple of things, but I don't really like the idea of pre-teaching 12, 15 words before reading. Sometimes I think it's quite time-consuming. It can be done really well, but if it's not necessary for them to know it, then you know. But it's a judgment call. It depends on the text. It depends on the task.
It's a funny thing though, isn't it? Because how do you decide what are your internal criteria? In other words, so whether you mentioned things like, do they need it for the task? But are there any other criteria? That you're thinking about?
Yeah. Also stuff like how relevant is it going to be to their future language learning? I mean, for example, if it's a text about I don't know, going to the dentist, for example, I might want to mention some words that are quite common and they might want to use in other contexts, but I don't want to teach them the names of all of the different teeth because that's so specific and specialised. Why would they ever really need to know that? And so there's a lot of criteria connected to their more general language profile. So if they're going to, if it's going to be relevant and active in their language learning, in their later language learning, then I might look at it. But again, that can be done afterwards. I mean, in terms of useful language, once you've gone from that kind of big, from the macro down to the micro, and they've gone through the reading skills, and they've gone through they've done the kind of detailed questions, that's a really nice time to go back and look at some of the really specific decoding of individual words and individual phrases. But it's quite hard to go from decoding backwards.
Why is that then?
Just because you don't bring any world knowledge to the word level. You're bringing world knowledge to general understanding. So it makes more sense sometimes to bring what students know and bring their own experiences as well about things, to predict and to look at a wider context for the text, and then go through the gist and then the controlled, detailed questions. And then, if they're not dying of boredom, having looked at this text for a while, then to focus on individual phrases that might be useful.
All right, well that sounds very sensible, doesn't it, audience?
Oh yeah.
Yes. But interesting further point to make, because one of our audience members here today, ladies and gentlemen, was talking to me earlier on about something quite interesting. She'd gone to the UK. And she was in Marks and Spencer's famous UK store. Yeah, and she was telling me a little story. There she was in Marks and Spencer's, and she saw this lady with a lovely pair of trousers. Oh, yeah. Okay. So she went up to her and said, "I really like your pants." She said, "I really like your pants." And where did you get them? Unsurprisingly, the woman was a bit affronted by this.
Yes.
Panted. Yes, panted.
Even.
Yes, by this. Because of a cultural difference. Yes. Because now I bring that up, of course, because, you know, cultural knowledge is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it is definitely. One of the teaching jobs that I did was in Afghanistan, and it was probably one of the most different teaching experiences that I've ever had, because usually when you work in another country, you can kind of quite quickly adapt to what people know and their existing knowledge. But when I was working in Afghanistan, none of the texts had any connection at all to the life experiences of the people that I was teaching. And none of the questions did either, because a lot of the questions related to kind of personalising things afterwards turned into discussions that people just weren't allowed to have. And but the texts were really, really difficult. So, for example, if people were talking about, there was one text, I think it was in Headway, and it's connected to being international. And you know, the text is about drinking German beer and driving American cars and eating in McDonald's. And there's no way that I could ever have worked with those students with that text, not because of language, but just because of world knowledge and kind of sensitivity to their current experience, just being in a country that's having problems, let's say. And so, you know, I think as a teacher it was really important to feel confident enough either to adapt it or just to throw it out and actually even write my own text or find a text that was much more relevant to their world experience so that we could develop their skills. And I think that that's something that's really, really important, recognising the difference between developing skills and testing them. Because a lot of the time the way that we teach them, the text that we choose are not really connected to developing. It's more about read this, do you know the answer? Yes, tick, 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 right, very good. And the people who started the class being good at reading, finished being good at reading, and there's been no kind of improvement anywhere. And the people who are bad at reading, stay bad at reading, and there's no ongoing awareness or development or strategies. And so that for me was really important. So it took a lot of work in that context to try and design texts and tasks, honestly, that would actually be meaningful on a cultural level, but also on a language level and a skills level. So yeah, it was one of those things that you just have to suck it up and design it. You know, that's kind of the end word on that one.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to say thank you to Michelle Coleman for coming to our studio. I'd like to highlight one of her best pieces of advice: suck it up. Alright, thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed being in sunny Bolton.
You're welcome anytime.